Hello, this is Amanda Baruch with a lecture I call Perspectives on Narrative. Briefly, what I'd like to do today is give you an overview of the etymology of the word, talk a little bit about the functions of storytelling, introduce you to the narrative fallacy and alert you to its risks, discuss some storytelling traditions, and then close with some thoughts on how we can approach stories, both fictional and non-fictional, in ways that can be productive and meaningful. I find etymology fascinating. And of course, now that we have ready access to the Oxford English Dictionary, it's quite easy to investigate the roots of any word or many of the words that we use. Narration is one of those, an Anglo-Norman term. Its use reaches back in the 15th century to Old French, and even further in Latin to its root of narrare, which means to retell or to recount a tale, with the term narrus referring to knowledge or knowing. But the deep root of the term narrative or narration is the Proto-Indo-European term know, spelled N-G-O. So to me, this history of the term speaks to the role of narration in our efforts to understand our world. These efforts play out in both personal and social ways, and here what I've done is identify just a few possible functions of storytelling or narration for us, both personally and socially. On a personal level, narration sometimes is just a matter of self-expression. Some argue that expression is a deep felt human need, and the opportunity to tell a story in a way reminds us that we exist. It gives us an audience and it validates our perspective. So that's one possible personal function of narrative. A second function is coping with stress, change, and trauma. Of course, many therapeutic approaches use narrative, use the telling of the tale, the recounting of the experience to, in a way, understand what happened, but also to diffuse it of its emotional intensity. So that's one personal function that we'll be talking about a lot this semester. Another function that we'll discuss in some depth is the use of narrative to build a coherent identity. Of course, in this postmodern world, identities are much more fluid than they've ever been before. Modern life means identity changes. These range from our professional identity to our relationship identities to our gender identities. And it's a challenge, I think, for many people coping with these changes. Narrative can be a tool for coping with that challenge, and we do have a session on narratives of identity, and this will be a central theme of the course. Finally, on a personal level, when the world throws a whole lot at us, we use narrative to create meaning, to explain, and to understand what's happened. On a social level, narratives can serve to establish connections or commonalities. We saw this in the introduction that I prepared to myself and some that you have as well. When we meet someone, we tell parts of our stories in hopes that other people might share some of our experiences or find ways of connecting to us around those aspects. Another function that we have to acknowledge is the use of narratives to enforce norms. So we have parables and stories with morals, with clear morals, where people who commit transgressions are punished and suffer for that, while those who are virtuous are rewarded. I'm perhaps oversimplifying that, but as you look at narratives, also at public discourses, by the way, consider the extent to which stories are used to enforce norms. As an example, I was at a meeting last weekend where the police violence was being discussed, and one of the panelists said, well, I always tell my children that if a police officer tells them to do something, they just do it quick. For her, the moral of the recent spates of police killings is do what the officer tells you to. So watch, be alert to the role of narrative in enforcing norms as well. I think it's worth noting. And also for explaining differences. Often stories are developed to explain why one person's outcome is different from another. We struggle with these almost unjust aspects of human experience, and sometimes we use stories to explain those differences. Someone is poor because he just didn't try very hard. It used to be historically that we explain poverty with reference to alcoholism. In a broad social way, we use narrative to explain difference. I think the history of constellations is fascinating, and it illustrates one adaptive aspect of narrative. As you well know, the seat of human evolution is around the Nile, and the Nile floods periodically, and these floods can be quite devastating and massive. And Sirius, the dog star, as it turns out, rises just before the sun when the Nile is just about to flood. So, Sirius, after years and years of observation, well, people noticed this, and a whole narrative of the Sirius star was created. Stories and pictures have been placed in the sky to help to help monitor time, but to help track when the Nile is about to flood. So this is quite fascinating, and it illustrates a really adaptive function of narrative, which is to record regularities and to monitor regularities in the world as we know it. In a way, some say, human beings are meaning makers. We're meaning machines. We're really good at identifying patterns and regularities in the world. It is really adaptive, but it also lures us into something that others have called the narrative fallacy. That is to say, it's hard for us to look at a set of facts without weaving some kind of relationship into them. Indeed, one of my personal beefs against social science is the frequency with which we weave elaborate explanations into patterns that actually may or may not be real. So the narrative fallacy is our tendency to create narratives where they may or may not exist. And the problem is we often use it to oversimplify the world to shield ourselves from complexity and from randomness and from events that we can neither predict nor control. And we also tend to use them to support our own outlooks. So we build narratives that reinforce our own beliefs, and we can get into a kind of groupthink that ignores certain important realities that someone with a different outlook or a different perspective might see. So this is a hazard of the narrative fallacy. It rescues us from the blooming, buzzing confusion that William James attributes to infants. But at the same time, it can mislead us into thinking the world is really more simple, more controllable, and more predictable than it actually is. Now I'd like to turn to the context of narrative, where it happens, and explore what that might mean for stories and for narrative itself. Of course, original oral traditions placed narrative in a participatory communal experience. The storyteller might claim to be divinely inspired. Later, authors might resort to muses to explain their inspiration. The tradition might be used to preserve history. So the tradition of passing down the stories of our history is part of this oral tradition. Again, in a social control function, oral narratives serve to transmit values, and they gave people an opportunity to construct meaning together. One feature of the oral storytelling tradition was its transience. Um, Once a story was told, it was not written down or recorded or anywhere. It was in no way permanent. Quite a different venue for stories than print. Print places stories in quite a different, um, venue, as I already said. Here we have an authoritative but isolated storyteller. So here the storyteller is creating the story separate from the audience, without input or not, without reference to how the audience might respond. The stories told become static realities. They can't be woven to reflect or to respond to audience reaction. And they have sort of permanence, not, you know, eternal permanence, but stories that are placed in print are considerably more permanent and inmalleable than stories that are told orally. The introduction of print also introduced commercial interest into our storytelling. And we see this, of course, in the massive consolidation of publishing houses. Um, so, with the introduction of commercial interests, stories become a commodity, and the stories that are told become the stories that will sell. Some have argued that this has reduced the flexibility or the variation in the stories that get told. And in fact, when we look at Alan Grant's comments in preparation for our opening workshop, we'll see that he's critiquing this idea of grand narrative, arguing in favor of smaller narratives, of the importance of smaller narratives for change and for evolution of our species, of our culture. So stories in print, we take it for granted, but it might not be a bad exercise to look at it and reflect on whether it actually is inevitable, particularly with the growth of blogging. Blogging as narrative is utterly fascinating and delightful. I have a blog. I keep it on my website, and I enjoy the relationship with an imagined audience. Um, and also, blogging has a little bit of a communal aspect to it, because while you're sitting alone at your computer, there's the opportunity for readers to comment on your blog and to react to it. So blogging has been, I think, a very productive venue for narrative, and I would urge you, if you haven't already, to explore its possibilities. Now let's turn to the interpretation of stories. You might find this helpful in thinking about how to post your comments on readings. I hope it also will give you a broad perspective on how people looked at stories. Susan Langer wrote an essay called The Cultural Value of the Arts, which has been really widely cited in understanding what function art serves in our culture. She notes the universality of art. She argues that it's more universal than science, actually, when you look at cultures around the world. I don't know how that holds, but at any rate, she suggests that art fulfills a fundamental need, and it, as she says, educates our feelings. She suggests that all art expands our awareness of human experience and the range of feelings and emotions and empathies that is accessible to us. So that's, I think, quite a vital function of art. At about the same time that Langer was writing, another literary theorist, Kenneth Burke, was considering the function of literature in American culture, or in culture in general. And he wrote an essay titled Literature as Equipment for Living. In it, his argument, it's a little bit different, is that stories give names for new experiences. So as the world changes with technology and history, stories are our ways of naming these new things and thereby getting some control over them. He also suggested that stories provide strategies. This is more focused on the moralistic tale, but he does suggest that they help us explore various dimensions of the human experience and deliver things like consolation or vengeance. They might help us predict or foretell events, give us some warnings or admonitions. They might provide instruction or promise, or help us chart the development of human history. In our interpretation of stories, I've already mentioned the importance of getting beyond the I like it approach. There are lots of different ways to interpret stories, and I thought I'd just give you a few that might be handy. One really useful tool is to describe the story, describe the action, describe the people, describe the characters, describe the scene. Forcing yourself in writing to describe what's happening can alert you to things that you don't notice when you're just reading, when you're just in the flow of reading. So consider sitting down and in a paragraph describing the story. Consider asking yourself what literary devices are used. I attended a lecture by Robert Coover, who has been publishing in the New Yorker quite a lot lately, and I love his work. If you're interested, I'll be glad to show you. But anyway, Coover says that for him, story doesn't exist until he can identify the grand metaphor. So you might want to ask yourself, what is the grand metaphor in this story, or how is metaphor used? Metaphor is a really powerful literary device, but there are others, of course, allusion, alliteration. You can find those that are of interest to you and see how they're used in the story. Or you can ask yourself what the story means to you. Does it give you new words, insights, or perspectives into human experiences? Does it serve a function for you, and what function might that be? These are just a few questions that help you get beyond the I found this interesting, or I liked or I didn't like this aspect of a narrative. I found this image on a modern art website and thought it was useful because to me it gives us a really nice concrete metaphor for narrative. Narrative can be a door. It can open us up to new and exciting, frightening, informative experiences. And this semester, we'll go through that door together. And we'll probably end up at radically different places, but I think it'll be kind of interesting. And that concludes my remarks on narrative. I look forward to reading your posts and hearing your thoughts.